I just want to thank everybody for coming. I am excited to be here, and I'm so proud to be a part of this community of academics. And there's so many people in this room who have been cohorts and mentors and friends and just people. I've been to your weddings and I've seen your children birth and the whole gamut of things, and it's really significant to me. And I do want to welcome Kate, who is our youngest participant today. She is a future woman in science, and so I'm really excited to have her here today. And I will try not to get overly emotional about that before I unload all this stuff. But my dissertation title is The Development and Validation of an Agricultural Literacy Instrument Using the National Agricultural Literacy Outcomes that we refer to as the NALOs. And in thinking about the bigness of this topic, it's important for us to address what agriculture is. And agriculture is really addressing the needs of food, clothing, and shelter for a global population. The need for this research is really born out of the fact that we have a big chunk of our population who does not maintain or possess the ability to understand and communicate the value and source of agriculture in everyday life. And because that need exists, we have agricultural education programs, agricultural literacy efforts. We have developed the National Agricultural Literacy Outcomes, which are benchmarks and standards for a K-12 population. And we've had those about 5 years, but we still don't have an assessment tool formulated in a summative fashion for individuals who are post K-12. We don't have an assessment tool that's been developed to determine, are they agriculturally literate? Did they leave the system knowing anything about agriculture? And if so, on what level? That's just a tool that we don't have. And so the primary objective for the research was to develop and validate a functional tool that can really give us a summative assessment post 12th grade or the equivalent of 12th grade, and really provide that information for us to determine where are we now and where are we headed in the future. How can we formatively and summatively assess that progress over time? Of course, every big research project, most of you in this room know, it starts with the literature review. What did we know in the past, and how can that lead us to know where we are currently and where this future research needs to be directed? So the literature review, a big chunk of that is really looking at what is agriculture, what is agricultural literacy, and how do those terms, those definitions, how have they evolved over time? The evolution of those concepts really has led us to what were significant and seminal pieces of assessment information and data collection that has been done in the past, most significantly the food and fiber systems literacy. If you're involved in ag literacy on any level, the FFSL is really what we've depended upon for the last 2 decades. But now that we have the NALOs that are more aligned with national education standards, they have a level of grade appropriateness, they are cross-disciplinary and integrated with national education standards. In addition, they are built upon modern agricultural needs, not just things that have been done in the past, things as we look to the future. Those NALOs have been built to incorporate modern topics and modern issues that we are dealing with in agriculture. And now that we have those NALOs, future research really indicates that that's where we should be putting our focus. Rather than on using assessments of the past, we really need to build assessments that lead us to using the NALOs and using them properly, using them effectively. Other things that we have to evaluate within a lit review would be those elements that are associated with building a summative evaluation. Summative evaluation, most of you who are in education know that as end-of-level testing, right? Where we are going to score somebody from 0% to 100%. And looking at a summative evaluation score from that perspective is relatively problematic when we start assessing post-12th grade adults, because we already know coming in that they don't know nothing. Clearly, they must know something. But how do we, so what is it that we're going to build that builds an evaluation tool that is scaled in nature? And the piece that this research really focuses on is that information from the Program for International Student Assessment. This is a science assessment. We call it the PISA score. And it's relatively new information from their technical report. It allows us to look at a proficiency scale model where students are somewhere on this scale model and they're working from a lower level of efficacy to a higher level of efficacy. And the 3 proficiency stages that we've decided to highlight in this particular assessment we're going to build are those elements where we have the lowest level of proficiency would be called the exposure level, a mid-level would be known as a factual literacy level, and then of course applicable proficiency, where they can actually translate and interpret and move this information back and forth to a level of higher proficiency. So that's really how we've modeled this, is after the PISA model, to give us a range of where adults would be in terms of agricultural literacy. The methodology can really be summed up by looking at 3 phases of development. The first would be the instrument construction. We relied heavily upon a modified Delphi method, where we have 2 groups of experts. We have some instructional and teaching content experts, and we have agricultural content experts or specialists. Those individuals helped us develop 49 agricultural literacy items. From those 49 items, through an iterative process, they narrowed that down to about 45 that they felt like they could work with. And then we did some data collection in September of 2018. In fact, one of Michelle, I'm glad Michelle's here, one of Michelle and one of Denise's classes as well. I'm trying to think who were the other one was, oh yeah, and Marlene is here too. Awesome, I'm so glad. So my data collection people are here, this is great. We took our 45 items, 45 agricultural literacy items, we combined that with 12 demographic items, and we administered to about 600 Utah State University students between the ages of 18 and 23 over a 3-week period in October of 2018. And we used entry-level courses because we really wanted to highlight those students who really were just post high school. So we weren't letting their life experience drive the results of our instrument analysis. Instrument validation is really phase 3, where we, through the use of factor analysis, we're going to determine the outcomes of our survey. And what we were able to determine is that we could build 2 15-item agricultural literacy instruments. Okay, so here's the exciting part. I'm hurrying, Brian. Okay, so research question number 1 goes back to that Delphi method when we're constructing those questions. And it asks us, can we really summatively measure those benchmarks and standards of the NALOs? Can we actually do that with the questions that we've created? So within those 2-item, they're called JMALI, the Judd-Murray Agricultural Literacy Instrument. I'll just refer to it as JMALI. In those 2 JMALI instruments, what we find is that when we develop those Delphi committees, the selection of the experts is of critical importance, because those committees are ultimately going to be the foundational elements for developing content and construct validity within the instrument itself. And so we took the time to really select those experts very carefully. And then from those experts, we gave them specific parameters related to national education standards, grade level appropriateness, having them analyze them and try to meet the NALO demands. And specifically the NALO demands, we leaned very heavily on those agricultural content experts, not only to analyze, is the agricultural content specific and correct, but do they meet the NALO demands? And lastly, again, looking at the characteristics of summative evaluation. Are these questions meeting the parameters for good evaluation? And the conclusion is that JMALI is able to summatively measure those grade 12 benchmarks based on the NALO demands. Additionally, we've determined that the JMALI instruments can be used for formative assessment. That's the progressive assessment. So maybe a pre-test, post-test, as we look at ninth graders coming in, right, and 11th graders going, did we see an increase? We can look at those progressive elements over time. The second research question focuses on the instruments themselves, and this is where the bulk of the statistical analysis comes in. And I want to just pause and say the efforts of Dr. Longhurst, and in particular Dr. Koster, were just absolutely critical in helping me define the kind of statistical analysis that was necessary to meet these needs. And those two gentlemen were so generous with their time and their efforts. I'm very proud of the statistical analysis that we've conducted on these particular instruments and the outcomes that we received. Is Jamali a valid and reliable measure of proficiency stages of agricultural literacy? Well, we had actually, from our about 600 students, we had 515 assessments that came back that were useful for us. And out of that 500 somewhat assessments, we actually began the process by scoring those instruments based on 45 items. The maximum correct was 34, and then we built in proficiency groups based on those maximum score, So if students scored below 50%, we placed them in an exposure group. If they scored between 51 and 79%, we placed them in a literacy group. And then at or equal to 80%, we place them in applicable proficiency group. Once we have those groups analyzed, we can move on to factor analysis. And exploratory factor analysis, or EFA, really serves as a funnel to say, of those 45 items, which of those items are really meeting those proficiency stages, right? Not only as the question was written by your panels of experts, but can we validate that through statistical means? Does that question actually belong in that particular place? And the exploratory factor analysis helps us define that accuracy. Of those items, we funneled that down into another 30. So only 30 items in 2 instruments were taken to the confirmatory factor analysis. Confirmatory factor analysis is the next level, if you will, of factor analysis, where we actually formulate a linear equation model. And we place as the latent factors our proficiency groups. And then ideally what we want to see from a confirmatory factor analysis is, if this is our model, right? We have these variables, these are our NALO themes that are connected. Are these variables, if we treat the NALOs as if they don't exist, will those proficiency stages still load in the proper places? So we're still looking for that. And that indicates what we call a model fit. Good model fit doesn't mean, woohoo, 100%, here we go. It just means this model is plausible and we're on the right track. And our CFA results came back really even better than we thought they would, if you want the total truth. So we were really excited to see those CFA results. The model is fitting adequately for the 3 proficiency stages using the NALO themes as variables. That said, a CFA operates in a little unique space, where what we really want to see is that the variables, the variables themselves are independent. And what we know for sure is that the NALO themes are not independent. Anytime you start talking about one theme is agriculture and the environment, and the next thing is food, plants, and animals, and the third theme is food, nutrition, and lifestyle, those things are related. There's no way to get away from that. So that model becomes non-orthogonal, which doesn't eliminate those results. It just means we need to treat them with a level of caution. Additionally, with the CFA, we coded our initial surveys as 0 being a wrong answer and 1 being a correct answer. CFA also operates on a 0-1 scale, so we have to just recognize that those statistical limitations exist. That said, due to the recommendation of Dr. Koster and other textbooks, things like that, discriminant analysis allows us to better understand what is happening within the CFA. So we ran an additional discriminant analysis post CFA to make sure that our groups, our proficiency groups, once they're grouped together, that they're actually showing accurate classifications. The cool part is that post discriminant analysis, what we really want to see is at least a minimum of 70% in proper classification of those items. And our numbers were anywhere between 91 and 100% in the classification. So I was really thrilled to see that happen. Additionally, just due to the way that discriminant analysis works, normally in a summative evaluation, especially a standardized summative evaluation, each item gets weighted score, right? A discriminant analysis allows us to simplify the 15 item scoring so that users don't have to weigh the score. They can just do 0 to 15, and then they know that we're somewhere on that scale. So really cool stuff, and the conclusion being we do have two 15-item Judd-Murray instruments that are valid and reliable. Questions 3 and 4 are really secondary in nature. Secondary emphasis in nature, and it really boils down to what can we learn from our participant population. We collected demographic information from them and other elements related to this particular population that can enhance what we're going to do in future research or tell us more about what's existing in this particular piece of research. And our third question focused on students who have a greater exposure to agriculture through courses or clubs or work experience. Do they actually have a higher level of self-perception, a higher level of self-perception that they have a higher level of agricultural literacy? And in fact, I mean, I kind of anticipated that's what we would see, but we have significant relationships between a participant's activity in courses or clubs and their ability to feel like I have a level of self-efficacy in perceptions of literacy. The fourth question takes that to the next level, because really now we're asking, if you feel like you have a high level of agricultural literacy, can you actually translate that to actual performance on one of the Judd-Murray instruments? And again, we are seeing positive correlations there. Not to the level of significance that we saw with the question number 3, and yet, while most results were not statistically significant, those positive relationships still render the resolution to us that students have a pretty acceptable or passable level of understanding what they know and can they translate those skills. Interesting side note, I think it's that second bullet point there, strong positive associations with students who said, self-reported, they had a good level of knowledge and then scored at a proficiency level. Students were really hesitant to say that they had an excellent, even if they scored at the proficiency level, which, I don't know, Dr. Lauver and I will have to go down that road in the next 5 years somewhere and figure out, you know, is this a confidence problem? I don't know. So some really interesting things as we kind of look forward to what's down the road. In teaching, I always come back to the fact where what we're really looking at here is the so what factors in the discussion. What are the elements of this research that really lend themselves to us getting something done now that we have this information? I want to start here with just a couple of key limitations. The first one being that the NALOs, as they've been developed, are incredibly, they're both broad and deep in scope and spectrum. And this is a 15-item assessment. There's no way that you're going to be able to summatively say this Judd-Murray instrument gives you a full scope of what students understand or adults understand about agricultural literacy, especially as that relates to the NALOs. It's just not a possibility. This is meant to be one small snapshot in time at this place for this moment, right? And progressively, we could say a week later, they could have improved in very significant ways, right? Based on experience or understanding of how things change. So it is important for us to understand that, you know, this is a snapshot. The second thing is that instrument 1 has been validated and instrument 2 has been validated. But educators and stakeholders cannot mix and match questions as they like, because it doesn't work that way. That's not how it works. So modifying those instruments means that you're getting a modification of the results, and that's just how it is. I also want to point out one little thing here. I feel very confident in saying that this instrument has been validated for an Intermountain West Caucasian population. I don't think it can be generalized to a national scale. It certainly doesn't represent national diversity. It's certainly on my radar as where we go next, right? Let's make this. But Utah State University ranks above the national average in overall diversity, but we are below the national average in racial diversity, and that is significantly lacking within this particular population. Implications for research. This really is looking ahead at the path that lies before us. Previous assessments really struggled to be unified. We had assessments that were modified from FFSL, some that were more current than others, some that used these benchmarks, and others built other benchmarks and standards. I'm really looking forward to utilizing not just the incorporation of the NALOs into educational research and education, but the use of Judd-Murray to really unify and clarify what our vision is for agricultural education and agricultural literacy. Immediately, I think Judd-Murray lends itself to be a tool to complete research that's necessary and needed by the National Center for Ag Literacy here at Utah State University and other multi-state efforts in research. Specifically, these two very important goals: assessing agricultural knowledge of diverse segments of the population and evaluating ag literacy programs to measure program impacts. I think Judd-Murray can make a huge, take a huge bite out of the need that exists there. I also want to point out that we are in such a unique point in time. The millennial and Gen Z generations, there are just so many of them that we are at a place where if we don't understand what they know and how they think about policy, and we don't have a plan in place to shape that with good science and good policy and good literacy and good education skills, we are going to be in trouble, because they are set to not just make some policy changes 10, 15 years down the road, they are set to transform agricultural policy over the next 20 years, and they will change it for a very long time. And so I think acknowledging that using assessment and data-driven results to determine what kinds of education and programs we're putting forth is of critical importance. Implications for practice, some of these I've highlighted already, but it is important to recognize that not only can we analyze what's going on a proficiency scale in terms of this student is at an exposure level, of literacy level, or proficiency level, but we can also break it down and look at the individual NALO components themselves. So there are 3 questions for theme 1, 3 for theme 2. I can't think all the way to theme 5, but you get the gist of it, right? And so by just looking at, boy, do we have a huge gap in understanding related to STEM? And off the record, Max and I both think that we do have a big gap. Students can tell us that, you know, a farmer drives a tractor and milk comes from a cow, but they cannot make the jump, even at a 12th grade level, that a farmer uses a computer and a cell phone to conduct business. There's a huge gap there in that 4th theme. So we can even look at that, the benefits of partial scoring, even just sitting down qualitatively and saying, Dave, you know, you're repeatedly missing this question. What is it that we can do, right, to interact with that and make that a better effort? 2 things I think are key importance considerations for educators. If educators use Judd-Murray without understanding what their outcomes are in the beginning, it's really hard to say that you're going to get to impact. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think we can do a better job of using the NALOs as the benchmarks and standards for really indicating where are we in terms of agricultural literacy. I think we can do a better job of that and using those benchmarks and standards, and then using Judd-Murray to kind of gauge, are we making progress in those areas? Additionally, this is old news for ag educators, but experiential learning. Questions 3 and 4 really are born out of the fact that the more exposure students have, the better they're going to feel about their level of ag literacy, and the better that they're going to score in terms of proficiency on an assessment. And even though experiential learning, active learning, project-based learning, these have been such a huge chunk of what we do, I still think the research bears out that we still have a level of illiteracy. And if that's the case, we really need to just be on it and continue to push and beat the drum for active learning. Considerations for program evaluation. Intimately, I've been involved in this particular question. Did this funding, workshop, in-service, kit, presentation, did this thing, intervention, increase the level of whoever this participant group is? Did it increase their level of ag literacy? Was it increased today? Was it increased over time because we did this week-long institute program? How do we answer that question? I think Judd-Murray is not a singular solution. Judd-Murray needs to be a part of a collective piece of data that is collected as a whole to evaluate programs. However, I do feel like we need to acknowledge that data-driven assessment is a critical part of good program evaluation, and that data, the more data that we can collect, whether that's longitudinal or snapshot in time by different sectors of populations that are served by educators and stakeholders, the better off we are. Overwhelmingly, what I've seen through my own career experience has been that, you know, when we're measuring this, we're saying, oh yes, they liked my presentation. Everyone said they liked it. So we're going to do it again, right? And this kit, we sold a lot of this kit, so we're going to say this kit is effective. But it's not moving the needle on ag literacy. And so we've got to have tools, and we've got to incorporate instructional and assessment tools in order to move that needle the way that we need to. I have the opportunity to build companion assessment instruments with Dr. Longhurst and Dr. Koster for K-5. And just working on these 3 different assessments simultaneously over the last 18 months, this has become so incredibly clear to me. Agriculture is a complex topic. It's conceptual in nature. That means it's big and it's messy and it's, you know, it's like that, you know, matrix, like all the neurons are just connecting everywhere within everything else. And sometimes we treat our educational practices and our assessment practices with such simplicity that I think we miss the mark. So even though we have simply, we've built a very simple tool here, I think when we look at it in terms of these are the NALOs, this is what we want to achieve. Now we're going to build these outcomes, and we're going to plan our program according to the outcomes and impacts that we want to see. And then we're going to use these varieties of assessment to get it done. And then we're going to make decisions of how we're going to move ahead in the future. That chain of complexity is warranted. We can't expect something that is as complex and overreaching as agriculture and agricultural literacy can be solved that fast with one thing in a very quick and easy way. I think it deserves the complexity of the concept of itself. And so I'm excited to be a part of this. This has been a thrilling project to work on. And I have a copy of the Judd-Murray instrument. If any of you want a copy of it at the end and you would like an answer key to go with it to determine your own proficiency level, some of you are sitting there thinking, I wonder if I'm proficient, or I wonder if I'm at an exposure level. There is no shame. We'll just Brene Brown the heck out of this, and we'll just say there's no shame. But I would be happy to provide those for you. But that's the presentation. Shall I open it up to questions?
I think we should give Rosa a hand.
Oh, okay.